three worst mistakes you can make in jiu-jitsu that are going to slow down your progress, make sure that you hit plateaus, and avoid any skill building long term. So if you don't want those things, you're going to want to avoid these. Number three is easily the biggest mistake that I've seen on all of social media from a lot of my students complaining about this mistake, and you're going to want to avoid that one the most. So the first mistake that I see most often out of the majority of training partners that I've trained with, people that I've coached online, is that they do not track their training sessions by any means possible. They don't take notes, they don't take videos, they don't analyze what they're doing. They are literally just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. If you're not tracking things, you can't actually measure them. So if you're not tracking, how are you going to measure it? If you can't measure it, how do you know if you're improving? The easiest way to do this is there's a couple of categories of how people track their training sessions. Most commonly, or the easiest method, everybody has an iPhone, well, some people have Androids, which is fucking weird. But they're going to be putting notes into their phone either before a training session of what they want to work on, what your intention is for the session, and what you're planning to achieve. Now, the biggest critique of this I always get when I say this is, oh, what about what my coach teaches? Well, what your coach teaches can be separated from what you're trying to do, and that's completely fine. They don't have to be identical subjects. So if you're coming in and your coach teaches you reverse de la Riva and you're wanting to work on half guard, well, what you could do in that instance specifically is find a way to match the two together so that you can get an expedited learning process for both of those things. If they completely are separated, like your coach was teaching you wrestling and you want to work on your guard, obviously there's a disconnect between those two things, but use your creativity to find a way that you could match them in together. And if you can't, have them separate, have them as separate entities. So what your coach teaches you, put it in that bucket, and then what you want to work on, put it in a separate bucket. And you're going to focus and track and measure the things that you want to work on, that you need to work on the most. Your lowest hanging fruit, for instance. If you don't attenuate your weaknesses, there's no point working on things that you're not bad at anyway. And so once you've got a system of measuring that and tracking it, either by notes on your phone or by written notes. There was a guy at Henzo's, curly head guy, what's his name? Heath. Yeah, he would write down notes during the class, which I thought was a bit crazy. But if it works for him, it works for him. And then would take notes after the session on what was successful, what failed, and then what he was going to work on for the next session, which is a great methodology on how to do it. You could quite as easily film a very short video at the end of your training session on the things that you wanted to work on. You could ask your coach a question and you could also film that. The whole idea is that you're tracking something and then you've got something as a leverage point to measure against. It's just like any sort of health outcomes. If you have no idea what your starting calories are, how are you going to be able to certify that you're in a deficit or in a surplus? Because you don't know where you're beginning, you don't know where you're tying that point to so that you can measure your progress. And if you don't know where you're starting, how are you going to measure where you end up? And you're just going to be throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. So find a method that works for you, track what went well, what didn't go well, what you need to improve on, and what you're going to do about it in the following session. And this maps on to everybody who trains from 1 to 10 times a week, from 1 to 3 times a week. The hobbyists and the pros, if you're not tracking it, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you're not going to feel like you're making progress. And this is also one of the biggest things regarding this that I always get asked, like, how do I break out of a plateau? Well, how do you know you're even in a plateau? Because you're not measuring anything you're doing. As soon as you start measuring the things you are doing, you'll be in a much better position to collect that data, make an assessment, and then actually use what you've found to move you forwards in the right direction. The second biggest mistake you're likely committing to is that you are not training your weak areas and you're neglecting the things that you are bad at, and you don't do them very often. I get the idea that you want to come to training, and if you're a hobbyist, you're taking a little bit less serious than a professional. Everyone wants to be good. Everyone wants to be feeling validated within their technique, and that's completely okay. We're all in the same boat there. We want to feel like we're making strides and leaps forwards, and we're actually utilizing good technique and getting submissions and all that sort of stuff. First problem with that is that submissions aren't the way that you certify that you are getting progress. You could submit everybody in your training room having done no new things, and I would actually argue you've stayed the exact same. You've proved nothing. You haven't gone into new territory. You haven't expanded your technical assets, or your arsenal would be a better way to put it. And you haven't really learnt anything. If you go into training and you do the same DAS to the same people in the same position with the same passing at the beginning of the move, then you're not really going anywhere. You're not testing yourself. You're not going into unfamiliar realms, and likely the reason being is that you don't want to feel like you're put on the spot. You've attained some sort of hierarchy in your own gym where you're like the tough purple belt that always submits everybody. It's hard to dissolve all those labels. The way that you get around that is doing it incrementally. by not neglecting your weak areas. Now, what I mean by that is if you are a heavyweight, for instance, watching this video and you've never been put on your back, that's a massive weak area for obvious reasons. You're not going to then go with the training partners that you have very competitive rounds with and then put yourself on bottom and just get obliterated, because that's going to set a negative precedent for you. It's going to be painful and you're not going to want to go back into that environment ever again. And you won't do it. You won't put yourself in that position ever again. So what you're going to do is you're going to find somebody who's lower skill than you and a lighter weight than you, and you're going to practice the areas that you need to bring up specifically. So for instance, I've injured my meniscus quite recently, and I haven't been able to do a lot of passing because it's a lot of knee compression and my knee doesn't like that at the moment. So what I've been doing that I had been neglecting, that I haven't done in my usual rounds, is very late stage armbar defense. Now, I'm not going into the room and getting the black belts and the brown belts and the big strong guys immediately, because I haven't built the necessary confidence to turn my arm in late stage escapes without taking a couple pops or maybe pushing it a little bit too hard when I shouldn't have. So I've gone and taken a step back, allowed the white belts and the blue belts and the purple belts, who are lighter and smaller, which is most of the room anyway, get into full extension and really test the limits of complete extension. Now, this isn't something I would have ordinarily been doing without being injured, because obviously I've got a match coming up, but it's a nice little it's a nice little force to be able to put yourself into these bad positions. And you don't have to be injured to do this, by the way. This is just a nice little example that's present at the moment. And so you'll be finding somebody who's smaller than you most likely and a lower skill set, because they're, let's say you're doing side control escapes. You don't want to get stuck underneath the big fat guy who's 280 pounds, who's a brown belt and just does nothing on top of you, because you won't learn anything. It doesn't make any sense. Go with the smaller guy who's a lighter weight, figure out what you need to do in terms of formulating your escapes, and then focus on the key details. And if you are a lot bigger than this person, don't use strength. It doesn't make any sense. But what you'll do over time is you will stop neglecting those weak areas, because you're giving yourself the opportunity to learn things that you otherwise wouldn't have been doing in a low stakes environment. And if you do that for a long enough period, you slowly acclimatize to higher and higher stakes environments. And before you know it, over a 4 or 6 week period, you've already scaled all the way up to the top of the room, and you're utilizing the same techniques because you're sharpening it as you get better, going into a higher level of difficulty. So if you have been neglecting your weak areas, that's what I would do to start to build in some weakness training, and so that you don't have massive glaring holes in your game that you are going to be exposed in competition. Mistake number 3 is training at 100%. Every single round, every single session, every single sequence. Not only does this make you a bit of a shitty training partner, it makes you a shitty learner, because what you're going to be doing is relying on physical attributes such as speed, strength, tension, power, explosiveness, and you're going to be negating potential opportunities to slow the round down, actually assess the situation and see what's going on, and think about what you're doing. Jiu-Jitsu has been colloquially known as a lot of different things like murder yoga and all those funny ones, but body chess or physical chess. And in chess, it's not about speed, obviously, because it's not a physical game. It's a game on a board. And so if you closely associate that mindset towards jiu-jitsu, you're thinking about, how am I going to think my way through things? What are the possible options that are going on here? What do I have the opportunity to do right now in this current set of circumstances, based on all the relevant information of where their body is, where my body is? That becomes infinitely harder and nearing impossible when all you're doing is just sprinting through training sessions, trying to win everything at all costs, exhausting yourself because you're using too much strength, too much tension and the like. You're going to be far more fatigued. You're going to be far less precise. You're going to experience that mind blanking feeling that I get told about all the time from students and training partners. And the reason that they do that is because they put themselves into such a state of fatigue, their body goes into fight or flight, they start freaking out, and then they resort themselves to the devices that they've got ingrained heavily. And that is not necessarily good technique. Usually it's very bad technique. And you see Danaher talking about this on his posts all the time. He says that in the first 2 to 5 minutes of a match, you're going to get your strongest defenses, your sharpest technique, your best skill. in the last 5 minutes of a match, that's where you're going to get the breakthrough if you can accumulate fatigue into your opponent. And so if that's the mindset of your training partner who's going to allow you to fatigue yourself, what if you didn't play part of that game? You slowed everything right down to like 60, 70% and just had an awareness of what's going on, what isn't going on, where's my body, where's his body, what are the options that I have here? You see it time and time again, especially in competition at the white belt level where literally nothing happens in a match because they're both death gripping the fuck out of each other and trying to use speed, trying to use agility, trying to use power, tension, explosiveness. You're never seeing good looking jiu-jitsu at that level. And the reason is because they train like that all the time. You usually train very similar to how you compete, or at least when you get fatigued, you'll have an exposure of your bad techniques and your bad habits, and you'll have more bad techniques and more bad habits if that's the way that you train. So when you go into your next session, think about, before the rounds start, peeling everything back in terms of intensity, tension, strength, explosiveness, and put yourself in the best position to analyze where you're at currently and use the technique that you've either been taught or from the tracking in the first tip, the thing that you want to work on the most that's a glaring weakness. Because you won't get very far just trying to muscle your way through things, just trying to speed your way through things and sprint your way through things. Imagine if you had to do a math test after a marathon. Your cognitive abilities would be completely shot. So don't exhaust yourself on the way to trying to learn technique, because the chances are that you learn anything are slim to none. So once you follow the tips in this video, you'll no longer be making the top 3 mistakes that we see in the training room in jiu-jitsu. You'll be able to slow down, you'll be able to measure where you're at, you'll actually feel confident in the techniques that you're building because you won't be neglecting your weak areas. And over a long enough period of time, you'll start to lap all of your training partners that are doing the same thing that haven't watched the video.